Okay. Great. So as I said, we're talking about superscalar processors today, and we kind of introduced the concept last time. We're going to kind of pick up where we left off and go a little bit farther into it, and as well as I'm going to kind of lay the roadmap for the remaining few lectures in terms of how all these concepts are going to fit together. So if you remember last time when we said superscalar and just this concept, we were saying the goal was to increase the number of instructions in flight, and by this we meant having multiple instructions issuing, starting execution at the exact same time, right? So in a pipeline processor, we have multiple instructions in flight at a given time in different stages of execution. In a superscalar processor, we have multiple instructions in a given stage. In particular, execute, the one we're most concerned about. It means and start and execute at the same time. And so there's multiple challenges we kind of described. Most particularly, we were worried about how do you know it's safe to do things in parallel, right? Or if we have to make sure these new instructions don't conflict with previous instructions. These are slides from last time. And so we kind of brought this all together and say, okay, well, it's actually a pretty interesting process that happens here, right? Our code is written by a programmer. The compiler goes and creates a graph to figure out what's independent, what's not independent. It has to pick how to schedule things. It does its best. And those get compiled down into assembly and then machine code. And then that's given to our processor, which has to look at these dependencies and determine what can be done in parallel, right? And so in this particular example, remember from last Monday, that's not visible. Why is it on the wrong screen? OK, great. Oops. Great. OK, so what do we see? Well, we see that this red node is the top, and this yellow one is kind of independent. So actually, the compiler chose to hoist that one up. And the reason why is when it comes time to do superscale execution, that red one, that yellow one come in at the same time because they're independent, right? If you're doing sequential ISA, it would be perfectly legal to go from this red one to this dark blue. However, because dark blue was dependent on the pink red one, it would not be able to run at the same time. So we actually just had to have an idle slot here, right? So in this case, the compiler chose to pull an instruction up there to make it easier to do superscalar execution, and that worked out well. And we can see in this case, this does not change the ISA, right? There's no changing of the abstraction interface between the CPU and software. It's just the compiler had a little bit more insight into what the hardware was doing and chose a different code schedule which performed better, right? So this is a good example of that implementation detail versus abstraction detail, where the abstraction is still this illusion of one instruction at a time done sequentially. Those are semantics of the ISA. However, the processor is able to do multiple instructions in parallel, and when it's legal, and the compiler is aware of that, and so finesse the schedule to make that possible. So how might this actually look? Well, for example, a very common thing is when you actually have different sets of hardware because things are different, right? So you imagine on your RISC pipeline, you're going to have that 5-stage RISC that we're used to. That's kind of the integer path, right? If you have a floating point, that's different hardware. Typically, floating point integers are different ALUs. So this is different hardware. You kind of already have a separate parallel execution unit. So it's kind of this low-hanging fruit, right? So you can imagine, as shown here, you have these two different pipelines, and they're in the same processor. So you're going to share some resources, but they actually are kind of two conjoined processors. So here we have both of them doing the fetch, right? So you see fetch from integer, fetch from floating point, both doing decode, both executing. But now here's what's interesting, right? The integer pipeline does both integer operations and memory operations. The floating point operation does only floating point. In this particular example, the floating point takes longer. So it takes 3 cycles of execution for floating point versus integer takes only 1 execute, but there's a second cycle in case it does memory. OK, so we have these two choices. And so a given cycle, we can kind of see, or given instruction pair, we see that it goes through the pipeline. So here, we're showing them as pretty independent. In practice, they usually kind of come from the same source, and they split off. So how does this get hard? Well, the issue is when these two pipelines need to share data or go back and forth, or there's hazards between them, right? So this is for some example challenges. Well, what if you want to do a floating point loader store? So we show the integer pipeline is the one that does the memory operations. But so we have to do using memory operations on the integer pipeline. We want the data to get the data into the floating point pipeline. So number one, that floating point pipeline needs the data. So it's data hazard. If anything's depending on those loads, it needs to get the information. Additionally, in order to get the data into the floating point pipeline, you may have a structural hazard, right, where you have one pipeline and want to write the other pipeline. If you can imagine going back, or maybe it's better if I actually draw this one. Right, so yeah, can we see that? Okay, great. Okay, so we have fetch, decode, execute, memory, and then we have our extra long, FP execute. And yeah, if we want, we can say like this, right? So remember that here's where we're reading the register file, right? So we have our integer register file and our floating point register file. Is that at all readable? Oh, no, sorry. And then, of course, at the end of these pipelines, we need to write back. OK, so yeah, so same thing. This is going to also need to be accessed over here, so in both places. So if we do an integer, use this side to do a memory load for floating point, this data needs to find its way across into here. The problem is there may already be a floating point instruction that's already using those write ports that cycle, right? And so how might you solve this problem? Well, as the slide says, there's a few trivial solutions. One is the floating point pipeline can simply just not issue something when there's a floating point memory operation coming back, right? So if I'm doing a floating point load up here, don't do anything down here. And that way, there's a slot, a bubble for me to write in here. That's one option. Another option is to simply add more ports to our floating point register file, in which case we can get rid of that structural hazard. But that won't get rid of the data hazard, because if you still need the data, you're still waiting on data. So you're going to stall for that no matter what. And so if you imagine if you have loads followed by branches, which is very common, where you want to branch the outcome of something from memory, that's also going to be interesting, right? Where if you do this both in the same bundle, it gets harder. Additionally, maybe some of you may be remembering how often we've asked you questions about precise exceptions. You can imagine these kind of two pipelines operating semi-autonomously. We need to be very careful about how do we actually implement these things, right? So right now I'm kind of still exposing challenges. We're going to start talking more about solutions in a second, right? So this is an in-order risk, some of these challenges, right? If we actually get a little bit more superscalar and talk about doing like a scoreboarding, well, let me get a second look at this one. I'm confused. I am baffled by the slides, so I'm going to skip it. I'm sorry. OK, so I'll summarize by saying that, yes, you can do a superscalar processor for scoreboard. Remember, the point of a scoreboard is to keep track of what's available, what's not available. And that's just a succinct way to kind of summarize information. And you can reuse that for superscalar processor. But now for the more interesting ones, these dynamic superscalars, where we're talking about, when we say dynamic, that's kind of an implicit code word for out of order, if you guys haven't heard that yet. So the reason why it's dynamic is dynamically scheduled. When people say dynamic scheduling, you're talking about out of order. So you hear dynamic superscalar, that's out of order superscalar. OK, so what's going on? Well, we want instructions out of order. We want to do a lot of instructions. So we have out of order, we have dynamic. And superscalar. And so when we pull these instructions into our giant pipeline, we got to figure out how to play them out. And so here's an example where we're going to assume we can fetch and decode 2. We can rename 2 per cycle. We can even send 2 off execution per cycle. And we can see this particular processor has a few execution units, right? We have an ALU, a load store unit, and a FPU. So we have 3 units in this processor. However, we have only 2 slots to issue in a given cycle, but we have 3 units. We can definitely get a lot of things going at a given time. So in this example, we actually have a little, like as usual, we have a code snippet. So what are we doing? We're looking at a simple loop where we're going to load some data, add to it, and write it back, and then move through the loop. Right? We're going to continue on with our process. In this case, we're actually loops going backwards, and we're going to branch. But that's not too crazy. OK, so what happens? Well, here we're looking at that code. We have, you can imagine temporally, here's one iteration of that 5 instruction loop. Here's the next iteration of that 5 instruction loop. Because we have an out of order process of renaming, we can just keep doing things. OK, so how's this going to play out in the pipelines? Well, it's actually going to do pretty well. So let's talk about how this is going to play out. So first off, when we're talking about decode, we're not even showing fetch here. We can see we're doing 2 at a time. So in cycle 1, we fetch 2 instructions. Decode 2 instructions. Cycle 2, we decode 2 instructions. And then all of a sudden, wait, we're not getting 2 right here. I'll come back to that in just a second. But then 2, 2, 2, 2, right? Well, 1 if we run out of instructions. OK, so it's hungrily eating instructions. Why did it get in trouble here? Well, the issue here was this instruction was a branch, right? And so if I grab the branch and the instruction following that branch, I may not be executing the instruction following that branch, right? If the branch is not taken, then I should be executing that instruction. Or perhaps even the branch target is just the next instruction, which sometimes happens in code. But in general, for a conditional branch, you're probably not going to do the next instruction if it's taken, right? And so that one you're not going to be doing, right? So that's an example of what happens. So how would processor do this in practice? It actually would fetch and decode both instructions. And when it's decoding both, it would recognize, oh, wait, I have a conditional branch in the first slot. So I'm just going to discard that second slot and push it to the next time around. Now you can imagine a very clever processor could say, oh, wait, well, maybe that's useful. Maybe I will not be taken or something. That's totally doable. But for a simple implementation, for now, you can say, for things like conditional branches inside a fetch bundle, we're going to be scared and let them go. OK, so that's just kind of how the front end is going, how we're fetching, decoding. What about the rest? Well, for execution, we're actually a little bit limited in ILP here, right? Because we can start that load right away. We can't do that execute at the same time for the add because the add depends on the load. It's a raw hazard, right? So these 2 instructions are non-dependent. There's a hazard between them, right? There's a data dependence where we need that F0 in order to be reused, right? So we can't just kick that one off. OK, so what's going to happen? Well, that first instruction is going to go through memory. This is a quick pipeline, so it's going to go right back. The other one's going to be able to start. But yeah, so you can see here, it's telling us, yeah, the problem was we had this hazard. We were depending on that first floating point load. OK, so even though that add was held up because of that load, how about that store? Well, that store is the same problem. Right? The store also has a raw hazard. In this case, it's on the load, right? So the add's producing F4, the store is writing F4, so there's also a raw hazard. So that store is also going to be held up. Now, here you may notice the timing is a little interesting because that store is listed executing in 3, even though its data is not available. However, it doesn't actually do memory until 9. So in this case, on this particular example, in this particular pipeline, the store went into the load store unit as soon as the load exited it. However, it couldn't actually complete until it got the store data, right? And the store data wasn't produced until cycle 8, so in store 9, it could actually go in and write the thing. But there was a hazard here depending on it, right? And so this is kind of, being as aggressive as we can, trying to forward data around as soon as we can. The issue is that these 3 instructions right here in a row depend on each other. They aren't independent. So this is actually not ideal for a superscalar processor. We're actually not really getting a lot of bang from superscalerness here because they're dependent. So the fact we can do more instruction at a time starting off is not helping us so far. And so even though we're decoding a whole bunch of instructions at a time, we're actually not getting them through the back end very fast. So those instructions are filling up inside the instruction window inside the ROB. OK, so then what about the next instruction? Well, just simple add I for the loop information. That one actually starts really early, right? And the reason why is because it has information it needs, right? It doesn't depend on these other ones. It does have a write after read hazard with both the load and the store. However, with renaming, of course, that's going to go away. And so the only thing it was waiting for was our integer ALU, which should have been available pretty early on. The integer ALU was used to compute the address for the floating point load. And so once this progressed far enough and the address was calculated, then the ALU was available for this add to use it. OK, and then how's it going to keep going from here? Well, you computed that new value, and then the branch came in. And so we want to do the branch. Once again, the branch only depends on 1 and 2, which isn't even shown in this scope. So that one can execute pretty soon. And yeah, it's waiting on a new value of A1. So there's a raw hazard between the branch and the add I. So we have another raw hazard. So seeing this little code snippet, there's these dependencies. In this case, most of them are raw hazards because the write read hazard was gotten rid of by renaming, are holding us back. Right? The instructions really aren't that parallel. If I was to try and draw this out, right, we have the FLD, the FAdd, the how do you store it? We just say store double here, OK. So these are kind of in a sequential loop here, right? And then, yes, there's the add I and the BNE, right? And we can kind of call this, one iteration, right? So there's not a ton of parallelism here in terms of how this currently expressed in this code. And if we do the second iteration, we're going to see similar bottlenecks. The only difference is because it's an out-of-order processor, we're actually going to be attempting to do instructions from the second iteration before we even fully finish the first iteration. So we're going to see a few more hazards that are mostly structural due to units being busy. So OK, so first off, we're going to try and do that load. Well, when can this load go? As soon as, well, in this case, it's trying to control hazard. So as soon as this node needs to do it. It also depends on 1, which was produced even before then, because there's a raw hazard from the add I to the branch. So that's going to hold that up. OK, but then the load goes through. Great. The additional floating point add can be, of course, decoded, but it can't start until the data gets back because it has that same raw hazard as on F0. And so that's going to hold it back a little bit. So we're going to see it's going to wait till 13 till it's done. Same thing for the store. The store can get into that memory pipe early, but it can't actually complete memory until it gets that store data. And so it's going to be waiting for that. So it's going to be waiting on the add, and the add's waiting on getting more parts available. So also pointing out the fact that it shouldn't be the ALU in this case. Oh, here, yes, OK. Yeah, so earlier it's calculating the address. That's why it's having a structural hazard on the add. And we see similar hazards at the bottom. Once again, we have no structural hazard on the ALU because it's still in use for the memory operations to compute the store, as well as the first branch. And then we complete. So in this little code snippet, there wasn't a whole lot of ILP. So as a result, even though we had a too wide processor, we couldn't fully take advantage of it. Question?
So I don't quite understand the BNE1 hazards on the right there. In the second store data, you've got, I can see why it's waiting for the ALU because the previous FLD is busy calculating its memory address in cycle 7. Right?
Yeah.
And in cycle 6, the ALU is busy with the BNE. But why is it dependent on the BNE1?
So I think this is a little bit overeager a listing of hazards. So if we can contrast this from the prior SD1 up higher, we'll see that one, it was decoded one cycle. It attempted execution in the next cycle. However, as we discussed, it was waiting on the data, and it had to wait some time.
Well, it's waiting on F4 until it gets to, it can't do the memory operation until it gets F4.
Correct.
But it can do its other stuff in advance.
Yes, and so we see on down here, right? So it's 2, 3. Oh, sorry, this is always confusing for me. There we go. OK, so this is 2, 3, right? So basically, we decoded it saw a unit was free and we sent it out there, right? Here it's 5 is when it's decoded and sent out 8. So why was this not 5, 6 is kind of the question, right? Well, at 6, the B&E was still using the ALU, right? So that B&E 1 ALU is kind of like should be like a dash, right? That B&E is the structural hazard on the ALU occupying it. And then the FLD is also going to keep it occupied, computing its address. Okay. So it's still a structural hazard. I would agree maybe notation would be more clear. Good question. So if this was your code, how might you fix this? I heard unrolling. That's a great idea. Yeah. So why might unrolling help?
Because you have 2 parallel processes.
Yeah, exactly right. So the point of unrolling, right, is we are exposing more parallelism. In this case, these iterations for the loop are actually pretty independent. Even though there seems to be some hazards between them, each iteration is really pretty independent other than the loop arithmetic, right? And so through unrolling, we could get more things in flight at a much shorter range. Yes, that'd be good. So now we're going to kind of try to tie back all this talk of superscaleness back to content from last week, which is branch prediction, right? So remember I said last week, talking about branch prediction, we have all these various stages in our out-of-order processor. They're all potentially superscalar, and so we have to do branch prediction on superscalar aspects. And so in particular, let's imagine what happens when we fetch more than one instruction at a time. So here, we're not fetching one instruction, we're fetching 4 instructions, right? So horizontally is time, vertically is width within our superscalarness, right? And so you can see that it is all these challenges, right? Where if you grab 4 instructions, more than one of them may be a branch. And all the instructions after a branch are potentially instructions you should or should not be doing depending on the outcome of that branch. And so for these superscalar front ends, you need to handle all of these instructions. You've got to be a little bit more careful, right? So for example, if we imagine this thing was feeding from left to right. So we pulled in this first, some of these people refer to it as a fetch bundle, where there's multiple instructions coming in superscalar. So we have 4 instructions. One of them is a taken branch. In this case, our BTB got this wrong. It did not see that coming. And so what happens? Well, until the branch vectors overrode the BTB, we had this 2-cycle bubble. So we lost 2 fetch bundles, which in this case isn't just 2 instructions, it's 2 times our width, which is 4. So it's actually 8 instructions we just lost because of that. You can imagine finally we get instruction flow reestablished. We bring in a few more bundles. There's no more mispredictions. But perhaps there's another stall. Or in this case, for example, maybe your instruction cache is busy, has a cache miss. There can be various types of stalls and misses, right? Mostly the point of the slide is it kind of sees the challenge of just being aware when you have a superscalar pipeline, you're fetching multiple instructions simultaneously. If there's a branch or even multiple branches inside that fetch bundle, you can have multiple hazards, right? This is worth being conscious of the fact that you're trying to pull instructions in parallel. However, the semantics of the ISA in terms of how branches work are sequential. So it's hard to cleverly handle that. This part on the left is from last week where we talked about what are some things you might put in your front end. So I talked about this predictor. It's called OGEL. It's made by Mark Oskin, the same guy who did Tage. This is kind of the last design before Tage. We already talked about the RAS, talked about the BTB. The instruction tag, or BIT, people call this one branch instruction tag. This one's a small structure which I didn't really cover too much in this course because you can imagine being rolled into the RAS where basically the RAS needs to know the instruction you're pulling off is a return instruction, right? So how do you remember it's a return instruction? The BIT will tell you. But for my class, you can think of that as just being built into the RAS. So you really should think of this as branch predictor, RAS, and BTB. The actual fetch itself takes 2 cycles, right, in this particular example. So we don't have an entry into BTB. For us, just to pull the data out and to compute the target address manually takes us not until the third cycle, which is why we had that 2-cycle bubble. However, our branch predictors and BTBs can try and override our flow much sooner. So to kind of wrap everything we've done in this first 2 units of the course, I'd actually want to take a second to appreciate some of these structures within a contemporary core. So look at a modern Intel processor. The current architecture is referred to as Skylake. I'll be zooming in parts of the slide. So right now it's illegible, it's OK. I just want to give you a bird's eye view. So this is a third-party rendition of the architecture system. And you can see kind of just a few major structures, right? So this lighter part, this is the front end. And so what people call the front end, that's basically fetch and decode. And then the back end is kind of what you go afterwards. So here they call it execution engine. People call the back end, that's actually we start doing the actual out-of-order scheduling and actual arithmetic as well as memory operations. And then, of course, you can see this purple thing down here. This is the memory subsystem, right? This is how you get into it. So I'm going to kind of point some things out on the high level in this figure right now, and then we're going to go into some zoom areas, right? So, of course, here in memory subsystem, what do we have? Well, we have a level 1 data cache. We have some buffers I'll get to in a second. And then, of course, well, we have a level 1 that talks to the level 2 cache. And then, well, isn't there an I cache? Yes, there is. So way in the front end, there's a level 1 instruction cache. And remember I was saying how you can kind of specialize these caches for what they're doing. In this case, this one is feeding data straight into the fetch front end, whereas this one's feeding stuff into these memory ports back into the back end of the processor, right? So they are being used in different contexts. You remember before I talked about store buffers? Well, here's a store buffer right here. So let's dig into these, right? So digging into that front end, what do we see? Well, as I said, we have an instruction cache. In this case, this processor is going to pull off 16 bytes per cycle. So if you had 4-byte instructions, that would be only 4 instructions. Realize in x86, instructions of variable length. There's some that are only 1 byte, some get as long as 7 bytes. So it depends on which one you're using and how it's encoded. But so these are going to come in. And because of the complexity of a variable length ISA, there's a lot of things this poor processor has to do. So it's going to pull these data in. It's going to try and look for opportunities to pull it together. So I haven't covered this in this course yet. There's something called macro op fusion, where if you have multiple instructions that you realize could be combined, you could. So even though I described earlier how RISC versus CISC, you kind of want to go simple as fast. On a big processor, some of those hard instructions aren't too hard for you to do, and you actually deliberately make it even more harder, make it more complex instruction by fusing 2 RISC instructions, so more complicated macro instructions, so to speak. And so actually modern pipelines go both ways. There's what's called micro-op fission, where you take a big instruction and break it into multiple smaller micro-ops, or there's macro-op fusion, where you take multiple instructions and make it into a bigger instruction. The takeaway for you is that just because there's something the ISA says is an instruction does not mean that's the instruction the processor speaks internally. So this is something Intel did a long time ago in the 90s when the RISCs were taking off in the late 80s. The RISCs were doing great. They had all these advantages over the CISC ISAs. And x86 and Intel, they were like, oh, wait, we can just, in the front end of our processor, turn these complicated CISC instructions into simpler RISC instructions. That was the micro-op decode. And we can do micro-ops. And these micro-ops are really just another word for a RISC instruction. So basically, from roughly here on, it's a RISC pipeline. It just has a little extra stuff in the front to decode this more complicated CISC ISA. But so in this example, we keep going down our pipeline. So we can see it's a 5-way decode. So here it can do 5 instructions at a time. And we can see, actually, wait, earlier there was more instructions coming out. But because some of them may have been fused together, now we're down to 5. And then, OK, so we have these micro-ops coming through. And where do they go? Well, there's all these parallel structures working together. We, of course, eventually want to get it out into the back end. We're doing parallel scheduling. But we've got to first contend for resources. OK, so let's say we actually started getting it out there. So what do we got to do? Well, there's 2 things, right? There's the ROB, which here, of course, is the rename, allocate, retirement. And then there's the issue window, which is here labeled a reservation station, right? So there's both, right? So instructions go into both when they come in. And we see now all of a sudden we're now, what is that? Is that 6 wide? That's 6 wide now. So it's actually getting wider as we're going farther into this processor. And this is our ROB, so of course instructions come out of here only when we commit them. And then instructions here, and of course, be considered for scheduling. And now it's actually getting very wide. We can see now it's actually 8 wide at this point, right? So that's superscalar in action, right? So this processor, on a given cycle, if it identifies 8 ready independent instructions, it can send them all out. And so we can see, depending on which port we use, the different ports do different things. So, for example, these ports over here, they have classic integer ALUs. Actually, the first 4 ports do. In addition, they have some more things, right? So some of them have vector extensions. And so x86 has multiple links of vectors. So if you do shorter vectors, they're independent. However, as this diagram is kind of indicating, if you do a 512 vector, which is currently the longest on x86, these 2 ports need to work together to share the resources. There's additionally some very complex instructions for AES and other things. Those are all, of course, all on this port. But then if you go over to the right, where are the other information? Well, we see we have, of course, a single unit dedicated branch. We see these AGUs. So what are AGUs? AGUs are address generation units. Those are the things I was describing earlier. Kind of remember we used the execution unit to compute the address. Well, here, hardware is cheap. We're actually going to dedicate an AGU to compute the addresses. So you can see there's actually 2 load ports and 1 store port, as well as the spare AGU. So of course, that store goes straight into that store buffer we talked about in the memory circulation section. And these loads, of course, go to load buffer. And so this is kind of a full processor, right? So you now can appreciate many of these terms. Now, this, of course, is extremely complicated. This is a state-of-the-art processor, and there's a lot of wrinkles. I haven't gone over all these wrinkles. Additionally, Intel sometimes just has different names for things everyone else calls one thing. This hopefully gives you a sense for kind of the complexity, but also, more importantly, the width of one of these processors, right? And we've seen these parts already in this course, right? We talked about caches down here. We talked about store buffers and load buffers. And then, of course, on the front end, we know these parts, right? There's a cache, there's a TLB, there's a branch predictor just guiding the use of this cache and the fetching. So hopefully these pieces kind of all fit together. Questions? OK, this is intended to give a brief overview. One more thing I forgot to bring up. So maybe if you're curious, maybe you're wondering, well, wait, these widths seem to be changing at different points. Here we're 8 wide. Here, what is that? That's 6 wide? Or that's also 8 wide. But here is 6 wide. Up higher, it's only 5 wide or 4 wide. Why would you have different widths? Well, it turns out, if you analyze the flow of your processor, a given stage in your processor may have non-uniform abilities to create or consume work, right? So you can imagine, for example, in execution, a lot of instructions can be waiting for one instruction. Right? If you have like one load and everyone depends on that load for all data hazards, they're all going to be held up. So you can imagine potentially execution could be very bursty, where you're waiting for data, waiting for data, waiting for data. Now I have data that can do a lot of work, waiting for data. So that one's more bursty. And so for the times you actually can do work, you're going to go wider to get more done. And in the case of execution, going wide there is actually not very expensive because you already have these units physically separate anyways. When you go backwards towards the front end, you actually get more. These are more expensive, right? Because when it comes to renaming, for example, if you're renaming superscalar, you got to do that sequentially within a cycle or 2 cycles or 4 cycles, however long it takes. And so to rename 4 instructions in a cycle is a lot more than renaming just 3 instructions in a cycle. And so here you have a more steady, continuous flow. And so you can get by having a narrower width because you're going to have less variance. And so that'll keep up. However, as I said, farther towards the back end, where things get more bursty, you're going to want to have a wider max width. OK, so that was just an example of kind of a contemporary processor. Let's put now the pure instructions. So based on what we talked about earlier in this lecture, if we imagine our baseline is a 5-stage in-order RISC processor executing the code on the right, and I tell you, I want you to make it go faster. And so in order to make it go faster, hopefully multiple things can make it go faster. And the question is, which one is the most economical? So this is a little bit of a judgment call, so there may not be a single right answer here. But try to weigh in your mind how much benefit performance-wise these changes would provide and how much it might cost. And that's a good hint. And so while you guys are thinking about that, let's see if I can, oh shoot. I forgot to make a Plickr thing for this. How can I do this both at the same time? I think I can drag the PowerPoint over. Is that going to work? Yeah, let's do that. OK. OK, so you guys can now see this question while I make a Plickr really quick. OK. OK, leave that up while I get to, OK, so let's go ahead and vote individually. OK. OK, great. OK, good. All right. There we go, yeah. OK. All right, why don't you guys talk to your neighbors? OK, let's vote now. I'm talking to your neighbors, second time. All right. Great. OK. Oh, interesting. So let's look at the votes. So for you guys can't see that. OK. All right. So initially, B was the leader. Talking to your neighbors, people got excited about C. OK, let's talk about these. OK, so for this question, it wasn't super critical to analyze the code, but it doesn't hurt to take a look. So now we're all pro at recognizing hazards and dependencies and independence, et cetera. So what do we have? Well, first we do a load. Then we have a raw hazard right here. What else happens? OK, well then we have another raw hazard. This one is a right after read hazard, which depending on our choices may not matter. And then here we have another raw hazard. OK. So why did I bother drawing the hazards? Well,
How is that wrong?
the branch is reading A1.
Yeah, okay, right.
Yeah. No, it's always worth taking a second to sanity check, where it's easy to get programmed to think about what's to the left or the right, and you got to reread those opcodes and make sure which one's which. OK, so if I was to try option A and make the processor 2 wide, what would happen? Well, we start off in order course, so we're still trying to go in order. We're just doing in order 2 wide. Well, I can't do these two at the same time, right? Because this mole depends on the load. So that would be kind of like 1, and then we can hand wave and say the load completed sooner, but we couldn't do, even if the load took only 1 cycle, we couldn't do the multiply and add at the same time either because there's another raw hazard, right? So already we kind of have multiple execution groups. This one is independent. So this could also be done at the same time as the previous one. Sure, we can toss that one in there together. And then a branch. So even if we optimistically assumed some things, we can see that there wasn't a whole lot of parallelism, at least not in the width of 2 wide. It was visible so far. OK, now what happens if we unroll it? Well, if we unroll it, I'm not going to write it out. We get a little bit more space, right? The 2 loads, for example. Actually, we're at the top part, right? So the 2 loads. Let's say we do T1. Can I do T1? Yeah, that'd be great. So T0, 0, A1, load T1, 8, A1, right? These 2 are independent, right? So those 2 could be done at the same time, right? So already we're exposing more parallelism there. And then same thing for that multiply, right? So there may be some issues between how long our memory pipe is versus our arithmetic pipe. But let's say I do T, this is T2, S1, T0, and then the second one, let's just say T3, S1, T1, right? Yes? No, correct. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. No. So great point. So maybe we should clarify why these are good. The reason why they are good is because in a real pipeline, we know that if we, for example, if we had our simple 5-stage, right? If this next instruction wasn't able to be done in parallel, we have to stall, right? Because that date's going to memory, right? So it's going to have to stall and then go. Now that we've unrolled, we're going to get rid of that stall, right? Because they're independent, et cetera, right? So basically, there are some hazards here. There's some stalls here that we're going to get rid of in the unrolling case. Now, if we came back to option C, which is to make the processor out of order, how might that help? Well, these are constrained by raw hazards, so these can't really be done out of order. This one could. So if renaming, we can do this one right away. And we could do this as soon as that one's available. So potentially an out-of-order processor, you get multiple iterations of this loop inside the ROB simultaneously. And depending on the length of our memory pipeline, multiple of these loads, multiplies, and adds in parallel as well over time, not over space. Because I didn't say make it super scalar, I just said out of order. OK, so let's kind of start adding these all up, right? So for A, 2 wide, as I was kind of talking about, because of these hazards, there's not a whole lot we can do in parallel, especially if we do things in order. So maybe here's the only place we really get 2 instructions issued at a time if we kind of temporarily ignore the stalling hazards. So there's not a whole lot of gain from going 2 wide there. Unrolling doesn't cost us any hardware, right? It's just a software change. And could get rid of some of those stalls. Making the processor out of order could potentially get rid of some of those stalls, but making the core out of order is like quite a bit more hardware. Now, if we did all 3, A, B, and C, that definitely will improve performance, but also cost the most, right? So kind of think about what these things cost. I said unrolling the loop is the cheapest, right? Because that's just a software change. making processor 2 wide superscalar. For an in order, going from 1 wide to 2 wide actually doesn't cost too much. There's actually a lot of research has kind of come to the same conclusion that both for in order and out of order cores, if you care about minimizing your joules per instruction, 2 wide is actually almost always commonly the right answer for that thing. If you start going 4, 5, 6 wide, you can go faster and you're going to pay a lot more for it. So you might say, well, why is 1 wide not less energy? Turns out going a little bit faster is better because you can better amortize your overheads, right? If your execution takes less time, the power you spend on everything, like your memory controller, your DRAM, those powers can be better amortized. So 2 wide is kind of this nice sweet spot where you go a little bit faster, the quadratic exponential costs haven't blown up on you yet, and so for many designs, 2 wide is most efficient. With regards to, let's bring it all back to this problem. Yeah, 2 wide wouldn't cost you too much, but in this case, it doesn't give you too much benefit. Unrolling gives you about as good as you can hope for. We can get basically nearly 100% function utilization for basically 0 cost in terms of hardware. Out of order would definitely help some, but it's the cost the most. You actually add a reorder buffer, renaming, etc. And then D is, of course, a combination of all the above. So it's going to get additional performance benefit, but also it's going to cost us more. Questions? OK. So in the remaining 2 minutes, I'm going to briefly introduce things. I'm going to pick up again on Wednesday. So far in this course, you've heard me talk about instruction level parallelism, or ILP. There's many types of parallelism available in processors. In addition to instruction level parallelism, meaning the instructions are independent, don't have hazards between them, there's something called thread level parallelism, which is, rather than talking about instructions, we're talking about entire flows of control flow, entire instruction streams. Additionally, there's also data level parallelism. So what is data level parallelism? Well, that's things that are independent operations based on working on different data. However, they have similar control flow. And so I'll go into this again in more detail on Wednesday. I just want to introduce these 3 types of parallelism: ILP, TLP, DLP. So far, we've mostly worried about ILP. And ILP is shown both by pipelining, out of order scheduling, superscalar, etc. But we'll be getting into TLP and DLP in the coming weeks. Additionally, there's something called MLP for memory level parallelism, which is really just as the name implies, you have multiple memory requests outstanding. So we kind of already briefly discussed this possibility of things like non-blocking caches and memory speculation. But in case you ever see that term, perhaps in one of the papers you may be reading, I just want to introduce that now.